Hi everyone. Today I'll be sharing some techniques for painting with acrylics. So today we're going to start off with a wash. A wash is typically used to prepare your canvas. It's nice to have a background color that sets a tone or a mood to your scene that you're painting, and also to fill in all those white spaces on your canvas that you may have left between when your paint gets applied on the texture of the canvas. So I'm diluting my paint slightly. I'm not using the full thickness of the paint by adding a bit of water into my paint there. The second technique is called masking. Masking may be familiar to you when you're using it to create some straight edges. Some of you already use that in creating your acrylic color wheels. To mask off certain areas means to block the paint from going there. And this can be also useful for creating some pure white spaces, not only just for creating crisp edges and lines, but I recommend not to paint fully over top of the masking tape. Even though it's blocking things out, paint can still get underneath the edges. And so I'm still trying to be careful to paint around the tape, but it just gives that extra barrier to block the paint from covering that spot. So I just want to draw your attention now to my palette. When I initially poured the paint onto my palette, I had separated some out that I'm going to be painting from. So I never actually used the paint that I poured directly on the palette to mix or to dilute. I separate the paint first and then do those different alterations to it. So when I first did my wash, I added a bit of water to my separate paint. And now that I'm doing a masking section, I was finding that that paint wasn't rich enough. And so I've gone back to add a bit more of that paint into that diluted section so that it's not going to be as watery as it was before. So the third technique I'm showing you now is called impasto. Impasto is often used by oil painters actually. It creates a thicker texture to your application of paint. When we're using acrylic paint though, because it has a lot of water in it before it's dried, we're going to use a medium, an acrylic medium called impasto medium. Sometimes this is also called structure paste or other names. This particular one is called impasto medium, and I'm going to mix some of my acrylic paint into that impasto paste. So you can see I've put a little bit onto my palette with a palette knife. I took a little bit of my acrylic paint. I didn't need much to mix into that impasto medium. And now I can spread it onto my paper more a bit like butter or spread. So from there, we're moving on to the dry brush technique. It's called dry brush because I've actually taken a new dry brush. There's no water on my brush or in my paint here. And the idea with a dry brush technique is that you're going to spread your paint out on the page or on the canvas until the brush runs out of paint. So it's a little bit hard on such a small space. I've also shown you there a dry brush technique with a fan brush. So basically it'll just be used to create texture and to create some dimension and layers in your painting. So we'll skip over this one that I'm doing right now because I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes. Next, I'm just going to quickly show you the splattering technique. You're just going to take some of your paint with a bit of water mixed in and splatter it on top. I find when you've got a wash underneath, it looks more interesting. And now I'm going to show you the glazing technique. So in that box where I drew the cube, you can see that when you mix water into your layers, the water tends to bleed out and lose its shape when mixed with acrylic paint, especially on a surface like acrylic paper or a canvas. However, we can use something called an acrylic medium to thin the paint and act almost like water would as far as diluting the paint and increasing the transparency, but it's not going to change the texture as much. And so when you paint, it will actually still hold its shape similar to the thickness of a typical acrylic paint and can be used to create layers with transparency. So this is especially useful for drawing or painting, things like shadows, when we're trying to have a shadow where we've got some transparency in the paint, that we can still see what's underneath it, but we've got some tint to create a difference in the value. You might also use this for painting something like a tinted colored glass, or even I've had students use this to create, for example, the glow of warm sunlight shining onto snow. So there's a variety of ways that you can use this, but you'll see throughout this video clip, I'm coming back to this later and building up with more layers as it dries in between. If you try to just paint over it right away, then it will not layer as effectively as if you give it a couple of minutes to dry. It doesn't really need that long. It dries pretty quickly, but letting it dry in between, making sure you also don't mix too much water and dry your brush in between, that can help you achieve more of an effective application of the glazing technique. We also have stippling or pointillism, which you'll recognize from our drawing techniques. This is when you're using dots that are closer together or further apart to create value. Many artists will also use this technique to layer and blend colors, as you'll see me do in a moment when I mix white paint into the stippling as well. So when you're using this technique, you can do as I'm currently doing right now, which is just leaving more space, allowing more of the white background to show through, or the wash that you have underneath it. And that's very similar to how we did it with drawing. However, if you mix colors together, you can actually create the illusion that the colors have been blended by letting them show through each other when you actually haven't pre-mixed or blended those colors. So it's kind of hard to show effectively in such a small little space like this. But if you look at some of the Impressionist painters, you'll see that some artists use this technique to paint their entire canvas. So for example, here the white dots and the blue dots are creating some blending and value differentiation just by layering them and building on top of each other. So I've come back to add one more layer of my glaze to just darken that value on that side of the cube there before moving to my next technique, which is a thinning gradation or a blending gradation. So we've already worked with value scales and acrylic paint. This time I'm actually trying to work quickly enough to blend the colors into each other. And you might not always have it as a distinctive value scale, but rather you might have, for example, areas of light and dark as you are blending, for example, skin tones, and you're seeing that shape of the anatomy underneath the skin, creating values, for example, cheekbones and jawbones, and how that value will emerge or recede from your canvas, and representing those features through your use of blending. We also have a technique called sgraffito, which you might see in your ceramics units as well. This can be applied in ceramic with layers of slip, but it can also be done in painting. I'm using the impasto medium again here to create a little bit of a thicker layer of paint. And then I'm actually drawing into the paint, removing some or lifting some off of my canvas to create some dimension, design, value, depending on what kind of artwork you're creating, some sort of pattern and texture in that thicker paint. Okay, and lastly, I'm going to show you how to do scumbling. I like to use a little bit of a bigger brush for this, and I'm creating some circular motions with my wrist to create that effect of blending. Rather than stroking the paintbrush, I am kind of swirling the paintbrush on the canvas. Again, this is hard to show in such a small space, but Many artists will use this to create, for example, skies with the clouds that are blending in and creating that subtle effect, or even a sunset. This can also be used for skin tones too. So just creating that softer blend of colors, not so stark as some of the other techniques. Okay, so at that point, you should have probably 5 boxes left over. I did 2 dry brush and 2 wash, and so that's why I've only got 3 left. But those extra 5 boxes should be used for you to select the techniques that you are most interested in using in your own artwork and demonstrating further practice and development in those skills.